There are moments in life, usually late at night, when everything inside a person becomes unusually still. Not because love has ended, but because it has gone quiet, waiting, holding itself back in fear of being misunderstood. And if these words have reached you, it may be that some part of you is already tired of pretending you feel nothing, while another part still quietly wonders if someone somewhere is still holding you in their thoughts the way you hold them in yours. Because the truth is often more complicated than it first appears. There are cases where someone loves you far more deeply than you can currently see. Not in the obvious, expressive, cinematic way people expect love to look, but in a more complicated emotional language, through hesitation, through inconsistency, through distance that is not born from lack of feeling, but from fear wrapped around feeling. Before you decide to close that chapter completely, it helps to understand something that many people only recognize when it is already too late. Silence does not always mean the end of love. Sometimes silence is what love looks like when it is overwhelmed, when it does not know how to survive its own intensity, when a person is trying to protect themselves from the very emotions they cannot fully express. Human beings are paradoxical when it comes to emotional connection. We spend years imagining that deep love is what we want, yet when it arrives in a form that touches the parts of us we have kept buried, something inside begins to react with fear instead of comfort. Carl Jung described the unconscious as something like a vast hidden layer beneath conscious awareness, shaping reactions we often cannot explain. When someone genuinely connects with you, they are not only meeting your surface personality, they are, often unintentionally, touching deeper emotional material, old insecurities, unmet needs, forgotten loneliness, and the quiet hope of finally being chosen without conditions. And this kind of emotional activation changes people internally. It does not always feel peaceful. Sometimes it feels destabilizing. It brings up parts of the self that were never fully healed, only hidden. This is one reason a person can genuinely care for you and still pull away at the exact moment closeness is needed most. On the surface, it looks contradictory. Psychologically, it is not, because love is not only warmth and comfort, love is also exposure. It is standing emotionally visible in front of another person without knowing whether that vulnerability will be met with care or used as a point of harm. And many people were never taught how to exist inside that kind of emotional openness. They learned how to protect themselves, how to stay composed, how to suppress emotional intensity, but not how to receive love without feeling endangered by it. So when someone begins to attach to you deeply, something in their internal world starts shifting in ways they may not consciously understand. Your presence starts to influence their emotional stability. Your attention becomes something their nervous system registers. Your absence feels heavier than expected. And without realizing it, they begin to feel that losing you is now possible in a way it wasn't before. That realization alone can trigger fear, because the mind tends to treat emotional significance as emotional risk. This is why emotional distance is so often misread. Not every withdrawal is absence of love. Sometimes it is evidence of too much feeling without enough internal safety to hold it. There are people who go cold because they do not care, and others who go distant because they care in a way they cannot regulate. The second type is emotionally conflicted. One part of them moves toward closeness, while another part pulls away, asking internally, what if this becomes loss again? Without awareness, they begin protecting themselves from pain that has not even occurred yet. And you may have already seen traces of this contradiction. The warmth, followed by silence, the subtle emotional tension in ordinary conversations, the way they notice small details about you without effort, the way their attention feels present one moment and distant the next. It creates an unfinished emotional rhythm, as if something is always building but never fully arriving. What often sits underneath this is unresolved emotional experience. People tend to imagine trauma as something dramatic and visible, but in reality it is often quiet and invisible. It lives in patterns of attachment, in discomfort with closeness, in withdrawal that activates when things start to matter. Some individuals begin to retreat emotionally precisely when they start caring, because intimacy unconsciously echoes earlier experiences of rejection, abandonment, or emotional pain that was never processed. They may not even fully understand why they behave this way. The subconscious mind carries more influence than most people realize. A person can feel genuine love and still act in ways that disrupt connection, simply because their nervous system associates emotional closeness with danger rather than safety. So they move toward you and away from you at the same time, wanting connection, but reacting to it as if it might cost them something they cannot afford to lose again. This is also why meaningful emotional connection requires more than intensity. Passion is immediate and easy. It can appear quickly and feel powerful. But deeper connection asks something far more demanding. It asks for emotional unlearning. It asks a person to loosen old protective patterns, to stay present even when discomfort arises, to trust again despite previous disappointment. For many people, that process feels like emotional risk rather than emotional safety. Silence itself needs to be understood in this context too. It is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is internal processing, where emotion is happening inwardly rather than outwardly. Some people express what they feel immediately. Others retreat into themselves when emotion becomes overwhelming, especially those who have learned to suppress vulnerability over time. In their case, silence is not always rejection. It can be containment, a way of not breaking under emotional pressure. But the painful part is how easily this creates misunderstanding. One person reads silence as distance or disinterest, while the other is experiencing it as emotional overload. One feels abandoned, while the other feels internally overwhelmed. And slowly, without either person intending it, emotional disconnection begins forming, not because love disappeared, but because communication could not hold the weight of what was being felt. This is where many people give up too soon. They interpret emotional complexity as emotional absence. They expect love to always look stable, direct, and easy to interpret. But psychologically, deep connections rarely function that way. They activate deeper layers of identity, bringing forward everything that was never fully healed: fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, fear of losing control, fear of needing someone too much. Carl Jung often emphasized that deep relational experiences can act like mirrors, reflecting not just affection, but inner fragmentation that still needs integration. In that sense, certain connections do not only feel romantic or emotional, they feel revealing. They expose hidden internal patterns that were previously unconscious, and that can be both transformative and unsettling. It is also possible that the person you are thinking about is experiencing their own version of this internal conflict right now. Moments of missing you, followed by prideful restraint. Thoughts of reaching out, followed by hesitation. Quiet, emotional replay of memories they pretend not to revisit. A push and pull between attachment and self-protection that continues even when nothing is being said. Because one of the most difficult truths in human psychology is that people often hurt more deeply in the relationships they care about the most, simply because those are the relationships where emotional stakes feel highest. And once you begin to understand behavior through this psychological lens rather than a purely emotional one, everything becomes more complex, but also more human. What once looked like indifference often begins to reveal itself as fear, conflict, and emotional uncertainty, trying to find balance within a person who has not yet learned how to hold love without feeling threatened by it. And perhaps this is the part your heart needed to hear the most today. Not every emotionally distant person is empty inside. Some are simply exhausted, worn down from years of carrying emotions they were never taught how to express safely. There are people who walk through life holding silent grief no one ever noticed. People who learned early that depending on others leads to disappointment, so they built emotional distance as protection. People who deeply crave softness and consistency, yet feel overwhelmed the moment they actually receive it. People who confuse calm love with something unfamiliar because chaos once felt more normal than peace. If this person truly cares about you, then what is happening inside them may be far more complicated than what appears on the surface. But there is another truth that must sit alongside this understanding, not replace it. Love by itself is not enough when emotional patterns remain unexamined. You cannot heal someone by sacrificing yourself repeatedly in hopes that your presence will eventually fix their fear. You cannot carry the emotional weight of two people and still remain whole. Real connection is never one-sided responsibility. Compassion matters, but so does self-respect. Understanding someone's wounds should never require you to abandon your own emotional stability in the process. This is where emotional maturity becomes necessary. Mature love does not reduce you. It does not require you to chase endlessly or shrink yourself just to maintain access to someone's attention. It does not confuse suffering with loyalty. Instead, it holds balance. It stays open without collapsing. It cares without self-erasure. It remains kind without becoming self-sacrificing to the point of emotional depletion. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for both people involved is not to force emotional clarity from someone who is still confused within themselves, but to allow space for that clarity to arise naturally, because no amount of external effort can override internal readiness. A person changes only when their own inner discomfort becomes strong enough to demand it. And perhaps this connection was never only about them. Perhaps it was also about you, about what it activated within you, about what it revealed, about how it forced you to notice the difference between genuine emotional alignment and emotional attachment built on uncertainty, about how it brought awareness to your own need for consistency, reassurance, and emotional reciprocity. Think honestly about this. Were there moments when your intuition spoke before your thoughts were willing to accept what it was saying? Moments when you could feel emotional inconsistency even without proof? Human intuition is not random. It constantly reads tone, silence, timing, shifts in energy, and emotional presence long before logic organizes it into understanding. This is why certain connections stay with us so deeply, not because they were stable, but because they awakened something inside us that had been dormant. And awakening is not always comfortable. Sometimes it arrives through longing, sometimes through confusion, sometimes through emotional distance that forces you inward, back to yourself, where truths can no longer be ignored. Pain has a way of stripping emotional illusions. It removes distortion. It reveals what was real beneath what was hoped. And this is why some relationships change you permanently, even if they never become stable in form. They push you into awareness. They force emotional growth. They expose what you were avoiding within yourself. At the same time, you may also be witnessing someone who is standing at the edge of their own emotional realization. Someone beginning to understand that avoidance no longer protects them the way it once did. Someone slowly recognizing that emotional suppression does not eliminate attachment, it only delays its expression. And when avoidance starts failing, internal truth begins to surface. There may come a point where silence becomes heavier than vulnerability, where emotional distance no longer feels safe, but lonely. And in that moment, change often begins, not suddenly, but quietly. A person starts noticing their own patterns. They begin to see how often fear has been steering their decisions. They start recognizing the cost of emotional withdrawal disguised as self-protection. But while someone else moves through their own internal process, you still have to move through yours. You cannot afford to lose yourself inside the uncertainty of another person's emotional timing. You cannot let inconsistency become the standard by which you measure your worth. Someone else's confusion is not evidence of your inadequacy. It is simply evidence of their internal conflict. Many emotionally unavailable people are not withholding love because you are unworthy of it. They are withholding because closeness activates fear inside them. Fear of dependence, fear of rejection, fear of losing control, fear of being fully seen. And paradoxically, the more meaningful the connection becomes, the more intense that fear can feel. This creates contradiction. One part of them moves toward connection. Another part pulls away from it. Without awareness and healing, they remain caught in this internal push and pull, unable to fully settle into emotional safety. But you cannot live inside that contradiction for them. You can understand someone deeply without becoming responsible for their emotional growth. You can care without self-abandonment. You can empathize without disappearing. That distinction is where emotional clarity begins. And still, Despite all of this complexity, there are connections that are worth effort. Connections where two people are willing to meet their own fears instead of projecting them, where accountability exists on both sides, where emotional honesty becomes more important than ego protection. These connections are rare, but they are real, and they require mutual willingness to grow, not just mutual intensity. Because every meaningful relationship eventually becomes a reflection of inner life. It shows you what you have healed and what you have not. It reveals patterns you were not consciously aware of. It brings shadow material to the surface: fear, insecurity, attachment wounds, unmet emotional needs. Until those inner layers are acknowledged, the same emotional cycles tend to repeat in different forms, different people, same patterns, different situations, same emotional lessons. And sometimes a connection becomes the catalyst for that awareness. It becomes psychologically significant not because it is perfect, but because it is revealing. It pushes you towards self-understanding, even if it arrives through discomfort. Still, even in the presence of emotional depth and psychological complexity, grounding is essential. Do not become attached to confusion just because it feels intense. Do not mistake emotional unpredictability for meaningful love. The nervous system can adapt to chaos and begin interpreting it as connection, even when it is not stability. Real emotional security may initially feel unfamiliar if you have been exposed to inconsistency for too long. But unfamiliar does not mean wrong, and intensity does not automatically mean truth. So hold both realities at once. Understand the psychology behind emotional distance, but do not abandon yourself in the process of understanding someone else. Stay compassionate, but stay anchored. Stay open, but stay aware. And above all, do not confuse someone else's emotional struggle with a reason to lose your own emotional center. This is why healing doesn't just change how you feel, it changes what you're even drawn to. When emotional healing begins, something subtle but powerful shifts inside a person. Confusion stops feeling like chemistry. Distance stops being mistaken for depth. Pain stops being confused with meaning. The heart slowly learns that it does not need chaos to feel alive anymore. Instead, it begins to recognize the quiet value of consistency, emotional safety, honesty, and peace. There is no longer a need to chase what feels uncertain just to prove love exists. There is no longer a desire to earn affection through emotional suffering, and in that shift, you start seeing things more clearly than before. Sometimes, a connection is not sent into your life to complete you, but to reshape you, to expand your awareness, to reveal your emotional patterns, to show you where you abandon yourself in the name of attachment, to wake you up to the difference between being emotionally attached and being emotionally aligned. It does not always arrive in comfort. Often it arrives in uncertainty. But even uncertainty can become a teacher when it pushes you back toward yourself. At the same time, every transformation has more than one side. If this person truly holds feelings for you, they may not be living in clarity either. They may be dealing with internal conflicts that are invisible from the outside. Old emotional wounds clashing with new emotional hope, fear pulling against desire, self-protection, fighting against vulnerability. And in their quiet moments, they may be replaying pieces of you in their mind, wondering if they have already lost something they did not fully know how to hold. Because human beings often carry regret more heavily than rejection. Many people can survive being told no, but struggle deeply with the possibility of permanent loss caused by their own silence. And so they hesitate, they withdraw, they delay, until one day the space they created becomes too wide to cross. Do not underestimate how deeply someone can feel while still struggling to express it. Some of the strongest emotional bonds are not loud. They are restrained, confused, unfinished. Not because restraint is ideal, but because people are often shaped by emotional histories they never consciously chose. Two people can care deeply for each other while still being unable to translate that care into steady action. And at the center of many of these dynamics is a quiet, unspoken question. Will you still stay if you see all of me? Beneath the silence, beneath pride, beneath emotional inconsistency, there is often a person who fears they are not enough in their most unguarded form. So they protect themselves by holding back. by keeping distance, by stepping away first so they do not have to experience being left later. It is a defense mechanism, not always a conscious decision, a way of saying, if I don't fully attach, I won't fully break. But love does not work according to emotional safety strategies. Even guarded attachment still feels pain. Even silent connection still creates longing. Even suppressed emotion still leaves impact. Eventually, what is not expressed does not disappear. It accumulates. This is why emotional honesty becomes so important. Not performance, not manipulation, not emotional dependence disguised as connection, but real honesty. The kind that sounds like, I don't fully understand what I feel, but I care. I'm afraid, but I'm still here. I don't have all the answers, but losing you feels real to me. Those moments can change the direction of a relationship more than anything else ever could, because they replace ambiguity with truth. And if that level of honesty ever arrives, something between two people can genuinely shift. But until that moment, if it comes at all, your responsibility is not to lose yourself inside waiting. Healing cannot be placed on hold for someone else's emotional readiness. Growth cannot depend on another person's timing. You are still allowed to move forward, still allowed to protect your emotional stability, still allowed to choose clarity over confusion. Because your worth was never meant to be measured by someone else's capacity to show up consistently. You are not too much for wanting clarity. You are not difficult for wanting emotional presence. You are not asking for excess when you desire reciprocity. These are not unreasonable needs. They are the foundation of emotional safety. And healthy love, even when imperfect, should still feel like a place where your nervous system can settle, not constantly brace itself. One day, whether with this person or someone more emotionally aligned, you will not find yourself decoding behavior or interpreting silence. You will not be searching for meaning in inconsistency. You will not feel like you are emotionally waiting for clarity that never arrives. Love will not feel like guessing. It will feel like recognition. But before that future arrives, this present experience still carries something meaningful within it. It may lead to reconciliation, or closure, or awakening, or simply the development of emotional courage. Not every connection ends in the way the mind first expects. Some exist to teach, to refine, to expose, to awaken. Still, do not ignore the deeper truth your intuition may already be trying to communicate. Somewhere in this complexity, there may still be real feeling. Not perfect feeling, not fully expressed feeling, but real nonetheless. And at the same time, feeling alone is never enough without emotional consistency to support it. People do not always become capable of love at the same moment they feel it. Emotional maturity often comes late, after misunderstanding, after distance, after loss, after realization. Sometimes only after nearly losing something important do people finally confront what they were avoiding within themselves. That is one of the painful patterns of human growth, but also one of its most honest truths. So instead of rushing to conclude the story, allow space for clarity to emerge naturally, but also allow yourself to remain grounded in your own emotional reality. Protect your peace without closing your heart. Stay open without becoming unguarded. Care without collapsing into uncertainty. Because the people who remain emotionally aware after disappointment are often the same people who eventually experience love in a more stable and truthful form. And perhaps when you look back on this chapter one day, it will not feel like only confusion or loss. It may also feel like the moment you began to see love differently, more clearly, more honestly, more wisely. If something in these words has reached you on a deeper level, hold on to that clarity. Not every connection that feels powerful is meant to be confused forever. Some are meant to guide you back to yourself first. And wherever this path leads next, let it move you closer to emotional clarity, not further into emotional guessing. Take care of your heart, and don't lose sight of what it means to be loved in a way that feels steady, present, and real.